So I think next, should I introduce, or are you gonna introduce? All right. We should get like organ music because we're gonna listen to Octane Jesus here, and we're gonna talk about.
Jesus.
We're gonna. So who? Yeah, he
died for your samples.
So we're going to be talking about lighting. So I had David actually on one of the podcasts for School of Motion that hopefully coming out soon, all about lighting. So we basically just roughly touch on some of the lighting techniques inside of Cinema 4D. But actually, maybe a good question is how many people think they really got their lighting game down in cinema?
That's a good question.
Probably no one. So this is great. David's really, okay, one. There's always one in a crowd, right? So David's really going to be covering a lot of stuff. I've learned a ton from him just interviewing on the podcast. So without further ado, David Ariew, a.k.a. Octane Jeebus.
Jeebus. Octane Jeepers. If any of you have seen Kimmy Schmidt. All right, so let's do this thing, EJ.
So just jump right into the questions?
Just jump right into the questions.
So why should I even give why should I give 5 craps about lighting? What's the big deal about lighting? Why should I be good at it?
Well, EJ, there's this thing called a DP, or a director of photography, and it's not just for shooting, it's for lighting. And indie DPs will wear many hats. They'll shoot, they'll direct, they'll do lighting, but higher level DPs, like Roger Deakins, for instance, are much more focused on lighting, and they create these crazy rigs and focus tons of time and energy into their lighting. So, am I on here with the dingus? Do you see this still? Yes, I like that transition. All right, so here is an example of one of these kind of crazy lighting rigs with tons of these soft lights up in the sky to create this nuclear holocaust look. So yeah, that's getting all this soft light in there. And then he created these crazy ring lights with just tons of these light bulbs. And here's a bunch of Ariew Fresnel lights all arrayed into a giant ring light. So they're just putting tons of effort into the lighting here. And DPs will direct the motion of the camera for sure, but a lot of the time their job is more focused on lighting. And when you think of lighting and composition and camera movement, those things together basically make up all of cinematography. That's not to say that actors aren't super important in directing. Obviously, that's the other side of the coin. And as motion graphics artists, we weirdly have to do that ourselves. We have to create the movement of characters, rig and animate. We have to animate the objects and that kind of stuff. But if you're good at lighting, camera movement, and composition, then you can bring a static, boring, concrete scene to life. And that's like the most fun part for me in motion design, is that lighting, texturing, composition, and camera movement. And I'd say that like 1/4 of my work when I'm working on a project is devoted to lighting. So I'd say that in a nutshell is why it's important to be good at lighting. It just creates such a mood and is so important to the story.
So how many people think they actually invest at least 1/4 of their 3D workflow on lighting? All right,
good job,
that's awesome.
Guys.
Good
That's
job,
awesome.
yeah.
That's
I
rad.
think
just throw an HDRI on it.
Shut your dirty mouth.
Shut your damn mouth, Matt.
So all right, if we want to get better at lighting, the first step is like, what lights do you use and where the heck do you put them? How do you decide how to do that?
Totally. That's a really good question, EJ.
You're welcome that I asked that.
I'm pretty freeform about it, but I definitely like a strong backlight and more moody scenes for my space stuff. So here's an example of my space music video that I presented on, I think, a year ago here today. And you can see that it's pretty moody and dark, and I've got this double rim lit, backlit look for my hero spaceman here. And I'm drawing a lot of attention by doing that because the rest of it kind of falls off to darkness. But it really depends on the brief. If the brief is to be milky and glossy, then a low-con look would be more appropriate. And then you can throw in an HDRI and it can be more evenly lit versus these very deep shadows. So here's another example of I did this for Katy Perry. Here's a satellite. And again, it's got this is my style to a large degree. This is where I kind of, find my comfort zone, is this more intense lighting and deeper shadows. But this is another project I did recently, and it's important to be versatile and try out different styles. And so, with food photography here, you wouldn't want it to be all space, and like dark and moody, because then it wouldn't look appetizing. So for this project, it makes way more sense to use HDRIs and have more light bouncing around. And I actually did light this as well with area lights, but it just looks kind of like I had used, some HDRIs. And then if it's like an outdoor scene, here's a test that I've been doing recently with some God rays and Octane. You want it to look like it's outdoors. Or, this is from a recent project with ABC, more outdoorsy stuff. And then in this Wales project that I did recently, I've got this world beneath the clouds that's more of the space stuff, so very dark and moody and rimlit, but then when they come up above the clouds, it's got to look heavenly, and the light bounces around a ton more, in the clouds, and so you expect more of this kind of a little more evenly lit, hazy look. And then as far as, what colors I'm using, I think it's fun to play around with that orange and cyan thing that's like the Hollywood blockbuster look or whatever, which has a lot to do with skin tones, but it's definitely a good color combination because they're complementary colors. And it's also fine to have like, more of a stark monotone look too, and have all the lights be the same color temperature. So again, it just matters on the brief and kind of what direction you're trying to execute and doing something intentionally. Another super popular look is that, Beeple look, like that cyan and magenta kind of thing. So recently I've been playing around a lot more with greater variation of colors and saturation. So this was for Dead Mouse, and here I've got all sorts of like purpley hues mixed with cyans, and I think these colors also complement each other pretty well. And then also for Dead Mouse, I'll play this here. This is using a stylistic, what I like to call a stylistic HDRI, because it's just a bunch of different super neon colored lights. This is Nick Scarcella's Manhattan Nights, so you should check out those packs for sure. They're amazing. And he went into Times Square and shot these HDRIs mostly to get interesting reflection plates. And so when you throw these into your scenes, you're getting this added like variety of lights, and it looks like, I don't know, some kind of 80s, Miami vibe or something crazy. I like these rainbow colors. So that's kind of what I've been playing with recently with color combinations. And then EJ, this is a still from a tutorial that I did for him recently with some space pots. Combining the mundane with the, taking the most mundane thing and seeing if you can make it look cool.
Sexiest pot
Damn sexiest pots I've ever seen. And it's got that same kind of like intense, shadows and super bright highlights. But I think it's important when you're, creating saturated lights to pay attention to the hot spots, because a lot of the time I see lights that are just kind of a solid wash of color, versus here when you've got that white hot core and then falling off to a more saturated glow, that looks a lot more realistic. So try to be aware of that when you're playing with color and playing with more neon lights. Cool?
So like for that image, for example, you have that like top hot spotlight. When you're kind of placing lights in your scene, do you have a good idea of like, all right, I'm going to do the sexy pot, I'm going to have a cool overlight kind of thing? Or do you like just jump into a scene and you're like, let's put this light here and see what it's just like all willy-nilly like?
I like to willy-nilly it.
Willy-nilly it.
I mean, the beauty of willy-nilly, the beauty of like third-party render engines is that you get this IPR, interactive preview window. And that allows you to art direct in real time, which is so different from back in the day when you would use, when I was using standard and physical alone, I would be staring at these buckets forming extremely slowly, like pounding my head against the wall and then eventually giving up. So lighting was a much more difficult process. But now with these renderers, they allow you to preview that stuff in real time. So you really can just swing the lights around, and that gives you even more flexibility than like DPs on set, because they're tied down to actually physically moving the lights. We get it easy, so you can experiment, and I think that's really important. Personally, I do like to go for that, strong backlit look, and I'm going to show you a bit of a breakdown on some of my lighting setups. So this was a still that these are some stills that I pulled from my SIGGRAPH talk, and this is to show that a lot of the time I feel that artists rely on HDRIs as a crutch because they're baked lighting solutions. You just rotate them and there are these infinite lights super far away from, infinitely far away from the camera, and yeah, so they a lot of the time create a very flat look. So if you take a look here and here, we're seeing some pretty super flat looking stuff, and it's not intentionally designing the lighting. It's not highlighting these specific characters and objects in the scene.
How many people just try to light by just randomly selecting a bunch of HDRIs and wondering what, like, oh, that looks good. Oh, that looks good too. That looks like crap.
Yeah.
How many people light like that, and that's the extent of their lighting? Yeah, I was the same way.
Totally. And I was too for the longest time. These HDRIs are super popularized and kind of like jammed into our brain. We got to use HDRIs, guys. But really, the lights need to be custom for your scene, just like the camera movement needs to be designed specifically for what you've got in front of you. You don't know, like if it's some giant outdoor scene, the camera movement and lighting are going to be completely wildly different than an indoor scene. So I don't generally reach for presets. I don't reach for presets as much. I think it's important to, especially for like lighting, texturing, and camera movement, to design those from scratch for your scenes, because that just varies so greatly. It's not easy to just bottle that kind of thing, if that makes sense. So here, I've just set, instead of an HDRI, I'm just using a gray card, basically. I'm just using a gray texture inside the environment slot, and that's creating an ambient light, basically. So this is the base that I like to start from, at least with this interior scene. And then in Octane, you can select various pieces of geometry and turn them into lights. So I think that's a pretty natural process, choosing things in the scene and turning them to lights. It's much like luminance textures in standard and physical. So here I've selected some of these rings, and I'm like, okay, these are going to be lit up. And then these in the back here, these were just decals before, but let's turn them into these orange lights and get this kind of color contrast going on. And then if I bring down the fill, that ambient light, then we get something that's very moody and dramatic. And this is probably like 75% of the way there. The only issue at this point is that my character isn't really highlighted from the background. He's not really brought out of the background. He's kind of blending in, and the solution is to, put some rim lights on him there. So there's one backlight there, and there's a second one, and that really brings him out of the scene and draws our attention, because we're seeing this guy much brighter. So our eye is a lot of the time much more directed towards the most bright part of the scene, and then letting the rest fall off to darkness, especially in darker scenes, really draws your eye towards the subject there. Then this is another breakdown from my Kit Bash 3D stream the other day. So here I'm showing that I like to split out the environment from the sunlight. So I've got two HDRIs here and a sunlight. And the sunlight is creating this strong key light here on the side of this building, okay? And this is what it looks like off. So it looks a lot flatter. So obviously we want that on. But I like to create one HDRI for the background and one for this fill light, the general fill light and reflection on these buildings. So in Octane, you can actually set that where you've got a backplate HDRI, and then you've got another HDRI casting reflections, and then you can combine that with the daylight system. So having that control, I feel, really helps with like outdoor scenes and these epic scenes in terms of lighting. So again, that's the key light. That's really creating this nice glow and drawing interest with this side light. And then this is what it would look like if I just lit with the one HDRI that is in the background. That's the backplate right now. And I didn't like this because it gave this weird gradient, and it brought too much attention to the grungy dirt texture on the buildings. So this is what I used for the fill light. It's this more general kind of purpley blue. And I just used that same HDRI but rotated it askew in some weird way and found this result. So when I combine the two of those together, I get kind of a better result than any one of those things. Actually, I'm combining three things. It's the daylight and two HDRIs. So that's just a little breakdown on how I like to approach lighting.
I think it's really interesting to keep in mind your design fundamentals when you're lighting a scene, because your scene looked completely flat. You didn't know where your eye was supposed to go, but you help direct and add flow and value, contrast with a key light and stuff like that. I think that's
totally, yeah. You're looking for areas of light and shadow
Right. Sure. I think that's such a huge thing. So, what's some of your ways that you add? You know, you showed a little bit, like, but adding mood to a scene using lights. Like, what if you want to throw some Barry Manilow on to the cityscape or something? You know.
That's a great question. So I think it's important to study films. And a good place to start is, like, perhaps, you know, the film noir look is overly stylized and sometimes cheesy, but in a lot of, you know, ways, like Blade Runner, for instance, it's a great place to start with 3D to try to create that super stylistic thing, because you get these, like, shafts of light, you get very interesting shadows. We don't pay attention enough to shadows. And you get, you know, this dense atmosphere. So for these films, they're pumping the world, you know, the set full of atmosphere, and that's something that we often forget as 3D artists to do. So mimicking these and trying to recreate these lighting setups can be super beneficial, and I personally want to do a lot more of that, like recreating camera moves from my favorite films, whether it's 3D tracking them or just, like, you know, analyzing the camera move and redoing that by hand, and then also breaking down the lighting and trying to figure out for myself how that lighting was accomplished and trying to recreate that in 3D, because 3D is just a physical, or it's a simulation using physics of our real world. So if you get better at filmmaking, then you're going to get better at 3D. And that's kind of, that was my path to a large degree, was this uber generalist filmmaker person, you know, just dabbling in everything and then honing in on the 3D side of things. You can see here, you know, get like super interesting, like shadowy silhouette foreground with these beams of light and fog coming through the windows. And then here, this is an obvious, you know, Venetian blinds example, but the shadows are really sculpted, and we don't a lot of the time think about adding areas of interest into our scenes with shadows. We can place, you know, trees off camera or just little gobo cutouts to create shadows. For instance, recently, this is a project that I did for an Octane tutorial, and this would look way less interesting without the sweeping shadows. It looks cool, the texture's cool, the lighting is cool, but then the shadows give an extra dimension to it. And a lot of the time it even draws our eye across the text, like here. This sweeping shadow causes our eye to follow the motion and just kind of brings this whole static scene. It's just text sitting there to life, you know, these kind of sweeping horizontal lines. And it's kind of an interesting designy thing. And here, you can see how I set it up. It's extremely simple. It's just box, 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 and then there's another cube here that's kind of hard to see, but it's just sitting in front of the light, and it's rotating slowly, and it gives it this epic feeling like these big blast doors are opening off camera or something like that. And it's super simple to do, but not something that I see done very often. Cool.
So do you ever, like, you know, of course you animate lights as well. What about, like, HDRIs? Do you animate, like, the actual rotation or, like, the movement of an HDRI to get that same kind of effect too?
I think that works really well with text. If you're not actually seeing the HDRI and it's just like a reflection plate, I think it works well to have those reflections moving, and I often sweep the lights as well. So, like, with the daylight, you can, you know, sweep the light across the text, and that'll add an extra dimension, and same thing with those reflections. I think it's weird if you're seeing the HDRI, then it feels like the whole world is turning, and maybe that's a fun thing that you're doing, but otherwise it's maybe a bit weird. And then, yeah, the last thing I was going to say is volumetrics, you know, super important for creating moodiness. So I would say, you know, the most important things maybe are shadows, volumetrics, and lighting.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the dreaded three-point lighting setup. How many people use three-point lighting? How many people actually know why the heck they're using three-point lighting? Or are they just doing it to do it?
Nice.
All right, cool. So what are your thoughts about three-point lighting there, David?
I think that it's a great base to start from.
He hates it. He hates it.
I actually hate it. I'm lying. So I think that on set, it makes sense because it's like a really good starter guide, you know, to create a clean setup. But there's like maybe less time to experiment when you're on set, to move the lights around, and so you want something that's kind of a surefire way to get a good result. But now with 3D, we've got unlimited flexibility to just move the lights around, and that process of playing, I think, is so important. And that's that 25% of my work that I'm talking about, just moving lights around and seeing where it looks cool and where it's, you know, really bringing out the shape of the objects in my scenes. But yeah, I think it's a great base to start from, and I want to do more of this, like exploring lighting setups. So there's this book that I've got called New Cinematographers, and I definitely recommend checking it out. It's like famous cinematographers and their personal lighting setups. So you can copy some of those setups. Mitch over here also has this free lighting setup kit for Octane that's super great. You know, for starting out with a really stylish, cool base to put your models in and bring them to life. So I definitely recommend those kind of things. And you know, on the whole, sometimes I do start with a standard key light, fill light, you know, backlight kind of thing. But more commonly, I'll do 2 really strong backlights and maybe a fill to bring up the foreground a bit. But I like that shadowy foreground, and I really like you know, this intense rim that's clipping to white here. You know, it's around the whole character, and I think that's just dramatic and interesting, and feels a little more filmic. Like a lot of the time we're looking to, you know, artists are overly concerned with recreating reality and using HDRIs to do that, but reality is boring. We're trying to recreate films. Like we want things to look more cinematographic.
That's a word.
That's a word, yeah. Yeah, and I also, what's up? Is what? All of it's in camera. So I've totally like moved away from multipass and compositing because I personally, like, I got pretty good at color grading and editing and all these different things, and I like to see my one final window, and Octane really allows you to do that. You get the bloom in there, like, so you get glow, you can bake in the shallow depth of field, the motion blur, all that stuff looks better coming out of 3D anyway than doing it in post. I used to do the whole frisch luft and, you know, all those different passes and whatnot, and I still use passes sometimes if other people are compositing my stuff, but if I'm doing everything myself, then I think I can get the best result right out of Octane. So that's where I am. And I do the color grading even in Octane with their profiles that they use and dial the exposure and gamma and all those things against each other, because if you isolate things and you're like, oh, I'm going to do linear and do it flat like how I'm supposed to, and then send it to compositing, you might screw yourself over and realize, oh, wait a second, this doesn't have the colors that I need. You know, and I can white balance and do all that stuff directly in my IPR, all in context. So when I'm working, I'm like texturing, I'm lighting, I'm changing colors, I'm doing all that back and forth because there's no one single thing works in isolation. And by that I mean, like, the lighting depends on the materials and how the light's bouncing off the materials, and it depends on the color that you're viewing it through. You're viewing LUT, basically. And all of those things together create your final image. The volumetrics, I prefer to do that in camera, in render, because versus a Z depth pass, because then the light actually scatters. And all the light is from a single direction, and it all is, you know, treated as the same physical simulation. So that's the mindset that I've adopted, which is more of a Pixar approach, I like to call it, because they solve everything in 3D. And unless I'm working in a pipeline, which I never am because I'm a solo artist, you know, I don't bother doing much multipass at all. Even like image sequences, like backplates, I'll bring those in as image sequences so that they inherit the same shallow depth of field versus compositing a background in post. So yeah, that's my crazy rant on that workflow. Anyway, getting back, so I also really like Sidelight. So here's an example of some side lighting. And then this is some top light. So this is kind of top light and backlight combined. So yeah, I definitely like any of those. And then here, this is interesting because the lighting here is all generated from these tubes on the side. So it's almost has more of a realistic feel. There's not some magical backlight following my actor around. So you can see he's not rimlit in this example. It's just these tubes on the side. So like I said before, you can turn geometry into lights in Octane. You can do it too in physical with the luminance stuff. But in this case, I think it works to not have that rim light because his silhouette's still clean. Because the background is falling off into darkness. The one place where you get into trouble is like the front lit look. You know, we all know this selfie look, like this onboard flash in the camera looks terrible because it's from the same perspective as the lens. Okay? And that means that all the rays from that light are firing directly into this person's face and they're flattening it out. And when we're lighting, we're actually trying to, you know, sculpt the light and create a 3D shape. Even though we're working in 3D, this is ending up in a 2D medium. It's not VR, it's not the real world, it's ending up on a flat screen. And on a flat screen, we need to bring out the shapes as much as possible. And so to do that, you need your lights off axis from the point of view of the camera.
Yeah, I can't get my eyes off that zip-up turtleneck.
I know, that guy.
I think that's probably the worst part about that photo.
Yeah.
We don't know this guy. I don't know who that guy is.
But yeah, I forget, what were we talking about? 3-point lighting?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, 3-point lighting. It's great. No. I think the last thing I was going to say is, like, we're trying to create a contrast ratio, and by that I mean a difference, from one side of the face to the other, or one side of the object that you're filming and the other. And the extremes are like noir filmmaking or stage lighting, for example. Stage lighting is maybe the best because you get these horribly harsh shadows and super bright light on one side and super dark on the other. You guys know what I'm talking about. So that's one extreme, and then the other extreme is completely flat. And I don't think either of those are necessarily that attractive. It's like maybe better to be somewhere in that gray zone, if that makes sense. Cool.
Sweet. So you're talking about placing lights and stuff like that, but we have like all these different types of lights. You got your area, your spot, your infinite. Like, how do you know when to use each? Like, what's your process for that?
Totally. So let's just run quickly through the different types of lights. So if you're familiar with standard or physical, I've just done some quick renders here for you. So here's a point light. It's kind of like a light bulb, or it's also referred to as an omni-light. It shines in all directions. And Dave Koss told me that it is a grid of spotlights in a cube. So like 6 spotlights. So that's interesting. And yeah, in this case, it's pretty hard. The light is hard, casting hard shadows. And then here is a spotlight. So this is more like stage lighting, like we were just talking about. The light's directional, and also creates, pretty hard shadows. Here's an area light. This is what we've all been told is, probably the best to use in standard or physical because it creates softer shadows, and it's like a bank, kind of like a Kino flow or something, and looks more realistic, has a nicer fall off, takes a lot longer, yada yada. Here's an infinite light, which just means it's infinitely far away, kind of like a sun. And you can see that the shadows are parallel. And in this case, you can choose between hard and soft shadows, though I think harder shadows would be more realistic because that's true to the sun and what we would expect to see from that kind of light source. So I'm going to jump now to Octane because that's literally where I've been working. I haven't actually really done a project in standard physical for probably 4 or 5 years now. So, and I've got a few more tools to talk about in Octane, but I'm going to show that you can get all of those same light types in Octane, but really it's all the same thing. They're all just lights. There's not that big of a difference between them. It's more important to understand what happens when they get bigger and smaller and further and closer and things like that.
So basically, there's only area lights in Octane,
in Octane,
right?
There's basically only area lights. So here is a point light, and all I've done is created a small sphere and set it to have a black body emission, which is just that thing I talked about before, which is taking geometry and allowing it to emit light. And here we've got these pretty sharp shadows because it's a small source. And here I've created a spotlight. So I basically took an area light shaped like a disc and shown it through a cone without caps. And that created this cone fall off, and this also has hard shadows. And if you want a spotlight that's a lot more versatile and has gobos and has interesting fall off and all sorts of options, then you go to Brograph and you get their Luminous plugin, which is, for Octane. And
Brograph.com.
Brograph.com. And the thing I'd like to point out with spotlights, though, is I feel like they come to life more. They have an interesting property in that they're directional. So if you add in some haze into the atmosphere, then you're going to see their actual beam and get that volumetric, interesting light that we're always looking for. And here we've just got a cube and a sphere, and it's a super boring scene, but just adding in that haze really brings this scene to light and highlights the fact that we've got this directional Fresnel spotlight because the light is getting focused by that cone. And here's an area light. This is, I think, what I do like 75% of my work with is just area lights. And it's like a bank of light, and it has softer shadows. And here I've created an infinite light in Octane by taking a light, putting it inside a null, and pushing it way far away. So because it's so far away and it's really intense, it creates these parallel shadows that are pretty hard shadows. And then there's also a daylight rig in Octane, which does some simulation of like the atmosphere. So at noon or whatever it is, you get some kind of bluer, you get these nice blue shadows and you get more of a direct light. And then as you bring the sun down towards the horizon, it turns all sunsetty and you get these interesting color shifting, and the sky turns, to a blue and orange gradient, which is all super cool and helps with outdoor scenes for sure. All right, I think that covers the main types of lights and vaguely what they do.
Yeah, so your background, I don't know if many people know, but before you went digital, you actually had cameras, you did real world, DPing,
I was a pretty clumsy DP,
right,
but it helped. So at one point I, definitely, dropped my whole salary or my whole savings on, Canon cameras and Steadicams and car rigs and all of these kinds of things. I think that was probably the biggest factor in allowing me to communicate with DPs, be a better VFX artist, train my eye, understand lensing, understand camera movement, and understand lighting and exposure. I think when I first started, that was one of the hardest things to get my head around, was just controlling exposure. And so by dealing with actual images from the camera, I got better at that. A lot of it was also just, color grading really helped. I became good at color grading. And after processing a crap ton of images, you get, when to reel in the highlights, how far to pull the blacks down, and to, how to shift the colors to get a more pleasing result. All of that applied directly to 3D.
So what was the hardest thing coming from that background to
right,
grasp once you actually went to 3D?
Yeah, I think so partially again, it was exposure. So with DSLRs, you have to worry about aperture, you have to worry about shutter speed, ISO, and the lights themselves. Those factors all control exposure. And by the lights themselves, I mean the intensity of the lights. So say the light's on a dimmer, you can dim it up and down and get different intensities, or you can walk the lights in and out to get more or less contribution of that light to the scene. So the closer the light, obviously, the more bright it's going to be. And then there's also the size of the lights. Now that isn't as pertaining to the real world, because we can't magically scale up and down lights, but in 3D that matters because you can take lights and scale them up and down, and then they become brighter as you scale them up, or dimmer as you scale them down. So those kind of things are all important. And then aperture is tied to the shallow depth of field, ISO is tied to noise, and shutter speed is tied to motion blur. And in 3D, those things are uncoupled, meaning you can change the shutter speed or the motion blur, without affecting the exposure. You can change the aperture without affecting the exposure, and that's actually a good thing. But you can still control the camera's basically interpretation to light by riding up and down the exposure slider. You can do that in both physical and in Octane. So you can reel in the highlights or totally change the camera's, how it perceives the light in your scene. So that's important to think about, and you can also change the gamma or the contrast. And then in 3D, you can also change the distance of the lights and the size of the lights. And it's important to understand how those actually affect your lighting. So for instance, here, I've got a very small light source, and it's creating these hard shadows. And the reason it's doing that, if you think about a pinhole camera, so with your aperture, if you've got a pinhole camera, then that focuses the light. And as light shines through that pinhole camera, you get a deep depth of field, meaning everything is in focus, versus a shallow depth of field where you've got a wider aperture and there are more points in that circle for light to shine through, so it becomes blurrier except for one, the plane that's in focus. So similar thing happens with shadows. So if you've got, imagine a small light source, like a point of light, those rays only have one place to come from, and so that focuses the shadows, basically. Whereas if we were to scale up this same light, and we've got this bigger area light that's a rectangle, imagine lines of rays of light coming from different points on this bigger rectangle. They now have the ability to, hit on this side of the sphere and this side of the sphere and overlap. And that overlap causes the softness, causes a gradation in the value. So that was difficult to wrap my head around, that bigger lights means softer shadows. So you can totally control the quality of light or the shadows, by scaling up and down your lights. Now, if you take that same big light source and move it back, like way far back, and then I boosted the intensity, you get something that looks, again, like a small light source, because now it's really far away. And you can see now that it's really far away, these shadows become parallel. And so it feels more like a sun, and it's got harder shadows. So with a sun, even though it's obviously a giant object, from our reference point, it's just a small point in the sky. And so that means that it's like a pinhole again, and it's focusing those rays, and these rays are traveling from a really, super vast distance, and all, coming in and creating hard shadows. So if you think of the sun, it acts like a hard, or a small light source, I should say, because it's so far away. So those concepts were pretty difficult to wrap my brain around. And then I think the next concept that was pretty tricky to wrap my head around was this rule of, it's called inverse square law. And what that means is, as you get closer and closer to a light source, it doesn't just increase the exposure linearly, it's an exponential curve. So it's kind of like that thing where, you know how 4K footage is not actually twice as big as 2K footage, it's 4 times as big as 2K footage, because it's an area problem. It's length by width. So it's got 4 times as many pixels. So a similar thing, if you've got a light that's like a foot away from me, from my reference point, if I bring it, say, a foot closer, then it's going to take up a lot more of my field of view, not just a linear amount, but length by width amount closer. So in this instance, we've got, pretend these 2 little spheres are 2 actors. We've got a softbox that's blasting this person because it's really close. And so that creates a problem on set where if you've got the lights really close, your actors can't move around very much, because if they move slightly, the light will rapidly fall off of them, and then as they get closer to the light, it'll blow their skin out. And so it works if you know your actors aren't going to move around that much, but if they need that flexibility of motion, then you need to walk the lights out and maybe increase their intensity. So if I do that and move this light back, now you can see that the relative intensities between these 2 spheres are much more similar because the light's not so close. And this was super important for like my space scenes where I've got these massive asteroid belts and I've got this little dude in the scene, and if I want to light up the whole scene, then I need these lights to be very far away. So I've got like the key and the fill very far away, lighting up the whole scene, but then I want to still light my little dude. And I do that by creating then really small lights and putting them just behind him that aren't affecting anything else because they're so close. So they're really highlighting my guy, and then the whole scene is also lit by these lights that are super far away. So that's how I deal with really big scenes. So yeah, those are 2 things that were very difficult to wrap my head around. And then I think the third is lighting for scale. So if you look at this shot this matte painting from Coco, they used over 7 million lights in one scene. And that gives it this epic scale. So for instance here, this looks big to our eye because we see all these little points of light and they're all falling off. It's not one light blasting on the whole thing. So for example, I did a really crappy demo here. So here's a cube that's just elongated and we're inside of it. And I'm shining one big softbox down into it. Okay, and it looks, pretty like soft shadows, like pretty small, like not very interesting. But what if I, instead of one big light, what if I used a bunch of smaller lights to light that same boring scene? Like this is the most basic scene you can possibly imagine. Okay, so now I've got pools of light. I've got several lights, and I've got one at the end of this thing, and now we're imagining it's a hallway. And suddenly it looks a lot bigger and more epic. Okay, and what if you made them even smaller and put them down here so they're visible and they look like practical lights in your shot? Now you could imagine it's a walkway, like illuminating this grand path. And obviously that comes to life even more when you add in textures and when you add in a little Beeple's people. So yeah, but lighting is so important for creating a sense of scale and communicating scale. And in reality, if you look at an underground chasm, you see these pools of light. You see these little, it goes light and then falls off to dark, and then light and then dark. And this is only the case in like a dark scene because at nighttime you'll see that fall off. Like if it's during the middle of the day, and we see something with grand scale that's lit by the sun, then that's okay because we know that that's the sun and it's a single light source and it's got hard shadows and it has all the characteristics we expect from the sun. But if we're like in an underground chasm or it's at nighttime, then we expect to see those little points of light and that fall off. So yeah, I think those are were the hardest things for me to understand, as well as that concept that I discussed earlier about how lighting doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's dependent on the volumetrics and the fog, the haze, that density of the atmosphere, color grading, your materials, and the shadows. So all of those things play together. And I play with them all in unison to try to create a final art-directed look.
I think that still you showed of just that cube is mind-blowing, because just the knowledge, like how much importance you should place on lighting to make something that's simple look amazing by like
totally
knowing how to paint with light, which is that blew my mind when you showed me that.
Totally.
So when you're cruising on the interwebs and you're flipping through the Instagrams, and you're seeing all these people trying to get those dope ass likes by posting all their Instagrammable photos on there, what are some of like for beginners that are people that are not familiar with lighting, what are some common mistakes you see people making over and over again as far as lighting?
I think we touched on a lot of them. Like one of the biggest is overuse of HDRIs, which are often just a crutch because they're baked lighting solutions and aren't like custom to your own scenes. They're one-click rotatey solutions, and they can be a great base to build off of, but they shouldn't be used as final solutions. And then do you use HDR and lights? Like it's okay? Yeah, it's totally okay to mix them both. Yeah, and I mean especially for like the stylistic HDRIs I showed, where I'm like just using them as reflection maps and then adding additional lights into the scene on top of that. I think it's important to use all of the above and know when one will be more beneficial than the other. If you've got like this glossy look and you want it to be really evenly lit, then you could just get away with an HDRI or an HDRI and a couple area lights. Combine them. And then I think another one I see a lot is that lights, don't need to be, or they need pure white hot spots. I think we touched on that. It's kind of a dead giveaway of bad CG when the light is just a wash of color. And I wouldn't necessarily call this a mistake, but it's obvious when people are using older renderers like standard and physical, because it's harder to get to that realistic result. Octane and these third-party renderers treat the light really nicely and have their own more rules internally that take the control away from you to some degree, but we want that control taken away because it's doing a physical simulation, and we want our results to look like the real world, unless we really don't. Unless we're going for the EJ look, or the luminance and cartoony or like Illustrator and these more graphical looks, either you're going for that or you're going for photoreal. But when you're in that gray zone, you're stuck in 90s CG land, and I see like black shadows that don't have any color to them. I see like really hard shadows. Those are dead giveaways of, that weird uncanny valley that, of just older looking CG. Stuff like not seeing motion blur in shots, things that we expect to see photographic traits. We expect to see cinematic traits in the imagery, shallow depth of field, all of those things. And then we also touched on, not lighting for scale. Like, if you're gonna, it's kind of a cop-out to say you've got this epic scene and you just blast it with a single giant 1,000-foot softbox. The reason that doesn't look real or big to our eyes because we've never seen a giant 1,000-foot softbox in reality. And if we did, we'd probably, if we saw that on a film, we'd probably think, oh, that looks like a miniature because it's got soft shadows and because it's all lit from one source and it doesn't look like the sun. So what the hell is it? So yeah, that can cause confusion. I think, know what scale you're trying to light to. And then, yeah, and also extremely hard shadows in that CG. I don't know if I mentioned that, but seeing that perfectly hard shadow is also a dead giveaway that, it's older CG and rendered with something a bit older.
I think to build off of that, not things that you do with the lights, but things you actually do to your geometry. You were talking about how, like, no shadow in real life is like completely pitch black. There's always some kind of value in there, or hue or something.
Yeah. If you like GI is another big one where you expect to see if there's like a red garden scene, you expect to see the bounce light from that onto the floor is also a little bit red, or you expect to see lights bouncing around a bit more rather than just this diffuse, ugly, hard look.
And one other thing is like if you just look at the world around you. Nothing is perfectly sharp-edged. Everything, no matter if it's
Bevels.
a knife or anything, bevel. So it actually picks up all those sexy lights that you actually map out in your scene.
Exactly.
So last question.
Last question.
And this is probably going to be a good one for people who are not in Octane yet but are thinking about it, or any third-party renderer, anyone out there thinking about going to a third-party renderer. Right, so we got quite a few. So And how many of those people are just learning 3D to begin with? All right, so a lot of the same people. So
sweet.
What's your advice to people who are just starting to learn 3D? Should they, what's the value in maybe learning physical render, the built-in renderers, and then jumping to Octane, or do you think they're okay with just jumping straight?
I think jump straight into Octane, Redshift, or Arnold. Because honestly, these renderers are easier to learn than standard or physical. I never even really fully learned physical. And the difference is that speed of art direction in these renderers make it a lot easier to perform tasks like lighting. Like I said, I used to like stare at these buckets forming for hours and then see what the lights looked like and then be like, oh, that's not right, and change it slightly and then do it again and just wait there. And that eventually just tires you out and you give up and you don't reach a creative lighting solution because, you know, it just takes too long. So, and honestly, I think that Octane is just a lot more intuitive to learn, and you know now it's getting to be that there are a lot more resources. I've got a bunch of tutorials on my site. Oh, hi EJ, your eyes are so pretty. Yeah, and I think if you're going again for that photoreal result, you know it's a physics simulation that treats the light a lot more nicely versus having to understand the physics behind it and make those tweaks yourself. Like it's like full manual mode versus semi-automatic or something. I don't know. You know what I'm saying?
That makes sense.
Yeah. Machine gun.
All right, so that, I think we're wrapped up with questions, but that's all the questions I have. Now,
one last thing I was going to say is that, like, though if you're just starting in Cinema 4D, I would still probably recommend starting with basic shapes, like light, or just basic colors. You know, it's like that transition from Illustrator After Effects directly into what EJ's doing with Sketch and Tune or with cell shading. Those handcrafted looks, it's like a totally legitimate, awesome look, and you can go all the way down that rabbit hole forever and work at amazing studios and do that kind of cell-shaded work or you know, cell animation or vector type animation with more flat colors and more of a graphical look. But if you're going for a realistic look, then I'd say jump right into one of the third-party render engines because they're going to make it a lot easier on you. There's no need to waste your time learning standard and physical.
Right. I think that, like, if you are to learn Octane, like, what's the purpose behind it? Do you want to go into the realistic stuff? If not, and like you're me and you like making little vinyl toy kind of stuff, then maybe that's not, you know, what you need. And you know, don't do it just because it's cool, people. All right.
Yeah.
But that's always important. Do what works for you. So cool. Yeah. And I think one last thing, I think stripping away, like, for the Sketch and Tune stuff, and if you are just learning lighting, I think it's important to not worry about textures and reflections and glass and stuff like that if you just want to get the basics of lighting down. So.
Yeah, just playing with shapes and color at first, you know.
Totally. Stripping away all the extraneous stuff. Mm-hmm. So now we're going to open it up to everyone out there. Anyone have a question for David? All right.
Hi, if you have a scene already created and you've already got the animation done and you haven't used Octane yet, can you bring Octane into that workflow?
Yeah,
or do you have to redo all your textures?
You do have to recreate the textures, so that's a process. You don't necessarily have to recreate the lights. Like the lights could be in the same position and then you apply Octane tags, but you're probably going to want to recreate, you're going to want to move the lights around and adjust those. So yeah, Octane, the things that it's doing are all the materials and texture system, the lighting, and then how the camera is interpreting the scene. So like those contrast curves, shallow depth of field, motion blur, just any of the making it look pretty stuff. But it's totally fine to take something that you've initially rendered, and I've seen a lot of people like the Brograph dudes have done it, where they've taken old scenes that they built in standard and physical and reworked them for Octane. Because if you've got solid animation curves and a nicely blocked out scene, that's half the work, and then the other half is making it look pretty. And Octane would just help you make it look a lot prettier than you would be able to potentially in physical, unless you're like a genius at physical. There are some people that are so good at physical and standard, and I don't understand them, but they can actually do that.
So she actually had another good question. Do you, in your experience, is it easy to, if you do make a physical material, does it translate well over to Octane, or is it like just the very basic materials that...
It can translate well in Octane, and I show in some of my tutorials how you can just in one click convert all the materials to Octane materials, but you're going to want to go and tweak them because it does it kind of stupid, you know? you're going to want to design them more with Octane's internal logic in mind.
All right, any other questions out there? All right, one in the back.
Do you use any types of ratio or a formula for your lights? Like a mathematical formula that's like your
that
standard?
Sounds too complicated for my brain.
Like intensity-wise? Yeah. Like intensity is like one brighter and the other two have to be...
No, I do it totally by eye and just feeling it out. It's more of an artistic process than any kind of technical process. I'm less of a technical person. I know enough of the technical stuff that allows me to be creative, but my focus is much more on being an artist and creating pretty pictures than it is on punching in numbers.
Very nice answer.
Thanks.
Any other question? This is your...
Otherwise, I'd be a neuroscientist, which I got a master's degree in neuroscience and pieced out on that.
Dissecting fruit flies, right?
Yeah, fruit fly brains.
Very tiny.
They were very tiny. I hated them.
All right. Oh, we got a couple over here. All right.
I know you mentioned DP background. Do you prefer an unbiased workflow, or do you wish Octane kind of had that biased kind of stuff?
I think unbiased, you get the easiest physical simulation. Like, it's taking a lot more control away from you to some degree, but then you get the most realistic looking result, and that doesn't bother me. Sometimes I wish that I could have a little more manual control, like light linking, and that's where our renderers like Arnold and Redshift do perform better to some degree. But I've also got a workflow of like just flagging off lights. When something's, thinking about where to place the shadows, you can create planes that are literally just light blockers that are invisible to the camera and will create shadows. So you can remove light from places. You can also just place flags by lights, and that's kind of how you do it on set. That's kind of a cop-out to say that. I do wish that you could do it more manually and do that light linking and manually choose which lights see what. But that process inherently breaks physics, if you think about it. You're going to end up with a result that doesn't look as real or maybe as pretty if you're doing that. But sometimes maybe you want to, for a client.
Any other questions? It's your last chance to get him into the Octane Jesus. You can answer your rendering prayers. Making me run back here again.
Octane Jesus.
Hey, what's up?
If you couldn't use Octane, what third party would you use?
So sad. Probably Redshift.
Redshift?
But only because it's a GPU renderer, and I'm up to my eyeballs in GPUs at this point. I've got six 1080 Ti's and 3 980 Ti's spread across 3 systems. So yeah, that's where all my render power is, though I think I prefer how Arnold looks, and I think I prefer the controls in Arnold to Redshift.
I was going to ask you about Arnold. If you didn't have the GPUs, would you go Arnold?
Yes.
Any more
questions?
One more. All right.
One more.
I guess it's kind of off the subject, but like, say, bouncing in between Arnold and Octane, like rounded corners, like modeled, beveled, deformer, like
do I use the rounded corner option in Octane? Is that what you're asking? Or are you saying, I'm not totally sure I'm understanding your question.
Like, I don't know if I know how to ask it any better.
So, like, are you talking about, like, chiseled bevels on text and stuff like that, or no?
Like, if you were to have to transfer a project to somebody else that you mocked up in Octane with rounded corners, like, you're like, hey, sorry, like...
Oh, yeah, sorry, you're screwed. Now all the corners are going to look sharp. I don't use the rounded corners thing that much. I think that's like a good hack, for if you're going quick. But ideally, the beveling will be in your geometry. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, where can people find you on the interwebs if they want to hit you up on the Twitters and the Instagrams?
My site is arievvisuals.com. So it's ARIEVVISUALS. So my name has a W, but it's pronounced like a V. So I'm forcing you to pronounce it right. So Ariew Visuals and the 2 V's make a W. It's all crazy like that. But yeah, I've got tutorials for EJ and then presentations, and I've got My work's all up there, and then I also have this resources page that has every Octane tutorial known to man. So I've like obsessively collect all these tutorials throughout my journey because I do that, and that's how I learn a lot of the time, is by part of it's experimentation for sure, but then another good part of it is just watching a crap ton of tutorials. And so at some point, it dawned on me that I could share this list that existed only in my brain with everybody else. So I kind of have just extensively culled and created that list on my site. If you want to learn Octane, that's probably the best place to learn how to do it. Cool. Anything else? Thanks, dudes.
All right, everybody, give a big round of applause to David.
Octane Jesus.
Brograph.com, an online resource for learning Cinema 4D, After Effects, and other motion graphics tools specifically catered to help you prevail as a motion graphic designer.
What's up, bros? Welcome to another Brograph motion graphics tutorial.
With tutorials, plugins, and now a podcast with tens of thousands of listeners worldwide.
Yeah, it's a great community to be part of.
We give you professional time-saving tips, industry news, interviews, shortcuts, and lessons that help keep you current in the world of motion design.
Join the HDR studio, take the render settings, pick the HDR, put in a reflection, and gorgeous.
I love projects that scare me. When our art director comes to us and asks for something that I had never done before, man, it gets me pumped.
Our weekly long-form podcast will give you the latest news, help you in your file management, hardware configuration, and client relations. Learn about the latest render engines, modeling techniques, and workflow integration while staying entertained.
Real nice banana.
Ah, that's so funny. All right. I'm going to live forever.
Our Brograph Talks are a chance to see the way industry leaders from around the globe are changing the face of motion design.
Sometimes you got to make stuff that you're not going to put on your reel, and I'm not here to judge.
The podcast and talks include people like Beeple, Barton Damer, Nick Campbell, Andrew Kramer, David Ariew, Chad Ashley, Paul Babb, EJ Hassenfratz, Mitch Myers, Chris Schmidt, Jules Urbach, Cornelius Dammert, David Brodeur, Andy Needham, Caitlin Kaju, Zubair Parker, Noseman, Ryan Bean, Casey Hupke, Nick Lyons, Sage, Joey Korenman, Jeremy Cox, Rick Barrett, John Dickinson, Matthias Omatola, Patrick Goski, Brandon Clements, Steve Teeple, Tom Glimpse, Patrick Longstrom, Julia Simone, Devin Coe, Al Heck, and even Deadmau5.
You get that render done. Yeah, you better frame what?
Our Brograph breakdowns go behind the projects and give you an insight on what it's like to manage and maintain your own personal business or work for a large company. Join us for live sessions, check out our useful plugins, watch time-lapse projects, interact with us, and send us email questions and topic ideas. Or just hit the Rando Render button and do an imaginative daily that'll keep you on your toes.
Take all your dreams and let's do it!
Subscribe today and get automatic updates on the latest tutorials, tricks, tips, and inspiration brought to you by industry professionals Dave Koss and Matt Milstead.
We don't care how you get here, folks. Just get here.
Subscribe now to Brograph Tutorials.
It's pretty good, I guess.